Awesome. Well, welcome to my party, everyone. We are doing 40 tips in 40-ish, I'm going to say minutes, because as anybody that's been to any of my other webinars knows that I like to talk, and I talk usually pretty quick. So hopefully I'll get through it all in 40 minutes. I do have 63 slides that I'm going to actually show you. And the reason I'm doing this in slides is because I wanted everything to be documented as to what I wanted to show you. If anybody is interested in the slide deck, it will probably, it'll just be a documentation of all the tips that I'm actually going through today. So it'll be a great way to actually have notes of what this webinar was all about. So every single tip has a slide. So that's why there's so many slides, because some of the tips actually I wanted to actually show you how to do it, so it's all documented in every single slide. So by all means, if you guys want that, just let Kim know and she'll have a PDF version of the slide deck that you guys can have for keeps. All right, so with that, these are kind of grouped in little categories. We put a nice little spin on them. 1 + 1 = 2, basically calculations. Radical rows, we're going to talk about the World Wide Web viewer. Taking a report from head to toe. There's going to be some hodgepodge stuff in there, some cool columns, how to keep things clean, making it mine, the need for speed, and some glamour shots. So the first thing that we want to talk about is calculations. So we got essentially 4 tips in each of these categories. We're going to talk about the CBR format code. We're going to talk about using the @unit calculations for non-controlling subs. Now, whenever I show you guys any of these kinds of tips, you can always take some of these tips and use them in other ways as well. So don't think that you can only use these in this way. We're going to use talk about non-printing columns. That's going to be in conjunction with tip number 2. And then I'm going to show you how to use the periods function to create some average calculations. All right, so first thing we're going to talk about is the CBR row and how to create like a % of sales or a % of revenue type column, or just a % column that you want to use as a denominator. So in this example, I wanted to actually show you how you can use different rows to create denominators. So like say in a report you have a revenue section and an expense section, and during the revenue section you want the percentage to be a % of revenue, but on the expense section you want that to be a % of expenses. So this is an example of a row format and a column definition. So this is going to be a row definition, and we've got our column definition here. And over here, we've got CBR calculations. So in row 115, you're defining a denominator. So what a CBR is basically a change base row definition, essentially, is what you're doing. So you're defining what you want the denominator to be from this point forward. So starting with row 115, it's going to take and any row past that would use 250 as the denominator. So 130 divided by 250, 160 divided by 250, until you get to the next CBR line, which is at row 415. And then you can add another CBR line. So now you're changing the denominator of your % calculation. And you're saying, okay, from this point on, starting at row 415, now I want my denominator to be row 760. So it's going to take total operating expenses. So now rows 430, 460, 490, 520, those would all use the denominator 760, the value that's going to come out on that row, as its denominator. So over here on the column side, to create those percentage columns, you would take column B and divide it by base row, where base row is that CBR row that you defined in your row definition. So you can then take column E to do the same thing, and you're saying one of these is going to be a month of, one of these is going to be a year to date. So column B gives you your periodic, column D gives you your year to date. All right, so the next one is being able to show a minority interest as a row on a consolidated income statement. So this kind of plays into, I only want certain branches of my tree to show certain calculations. All right, so in this report, we're showing a side-by-side comparison of our companies, and in a certain row, we want to show the non-controlling interest so that you can actually subtract that from your totals, okay? So to do that, you're going to start with a row where you create a calc line. And this is where you can use an at-unit calculation in combination with an if-then statement to actually create a calculation that only happens at certain branches of the tree. All right? So USMF is actually a branch of our tree that you're saying, okay, if the unit equals, and this is going to be the code from the tree, then do this calculation, else 0. And then you're using a column calculation or a column restriction to tell it exactly which columns, and you're going to get the column letters from the column definition. So I'm going to show you the column definition, and here's where we have columns B, C, D, E, F, G, H. So we were saying that we wanted E and J were the columns that are actually going to show. And in this slide, what you're going to see is non-printing rows to actually pull in some elimination information, and being able to kind of use this in conjunction with reporting units to restrict your columns to just certain branches of your tree. So if you ever needed to do a consolidated report where you needed to see side-by-side columns for each company, you have to use a tree, and you would actually use the reporting unit here to define which column is going to use which branch. And then over here, you're defining your elimination columns. You're going to bring in each company's eliminations, and you can even set it up so that certain companies, say you have 3 different companies, and the elimination accounts that you're using in each of those companies is going to be different. You can set up each column to define exactly which accounts are going to make up the eliminations. So here's an example of when you're in the reporting unit in column B. If you double click in there, it's going to actually show you an example of the tree that you would want to use, and then you'd pick the branch of the tree to restrict that column to only a certain branch of your tree. And this is an example of being able to use the dimension filter in your elimination column to be able to say only pull these accounts, to pull your elimination accounts into a certain company. So we're using that in conjunction with the reporting unit to say, okay, this company goes in this column, but now we're also restricting this column to only pull these certain accounts. So over here in the corner, you can see column I and J. We're adding up columns F, G, and H to actually total your eliminations, but you're bringing in your eliminations independently. So kind of to backtrack to bring this all in, you're creating a report that has side-by-side companies, okay? And we need to bring the eliminations in, but we need to bring the eliminations in per company. So you essentially are setting up 6 columns, and then three of those columns you're going to make non-printing so that you can then add them up together to create the eliminations. So essentially F, G, and H won't print, just I and J will print. So at the end of this report, E and J are where we want that minority interest to actually display. So back over here on the row, that's where we're going to take that calculation that we were creating for the minority interest to actually say only print this in column E and J. So here's the end result again. So you can see you've got the side-by-side companies. Here's the one elimination column. That's the total of all the eliminations for those that we've just added together. And we're only showing our minority interest in column E and column J. All right, so the next one I wanted to show you was the period function, which allows you to use the dynamic parameter in your calculations, which is then going to be used by your base code. So essentially what you're doing here is you're defining your base code in your calc column. So you're just saying use base. So if you run this report for October, this base would become 10. So periods becomes whatever this base is. So if you're then using this to say, all right, add up columns B through D and then divide by periods, then periods becomes whatever your base is up here. So this would essentially give you an average. So if you ran this for October, it would give you the average for October. So this would divide by 10. Okay? Cool columns, using a base minus 11 to base to create a rolling 12 months in a single column, using single numbers instead of dates to make weekly reports. We're going to talk about using the account column to include account numbers on your report. We're going to use the row code to actually put the row code information into your report as well. All right, so the first thing we're going to look at is a column. Say you want to have a single column that contains all 12 of the previous months. So you need to provide the users with 12 months worth of data, but you want it all in 1 month and you need it to be rolling. You can actually use a combination of base minus 11 colon base to create the column to give you all that information in one column. So if you use, for example, column, if you're running this for October, the formula would then become 10, base becomes 10, so 10 minus 11 becomes negative 1 colon 10, which will cross over your fiscal year, your calendar year, or fiscal year, whatever your years are. So like say you're on a calendar year where January is 1, December is 12, it knows to go back to the previous November to be able to pull in November and December into this as well. So you would still get November, December, and then January through October of the next year. So you get November and December of the previous year and January through October of the current year all in one column. In order to be able to get multiple fiscal years in a single column, you have to use an approach like this. You cannot use multiple years in your fiscal year. You can only do it by doing your base period. It knows what your fiscal periods are, so it knows whether you have 12 months, whether you have 13 periods, whether you're on a weekly calendar and you have 52 periods in your year. It knows how many fiscal periods you have. So if you're saying starting at a certain number and you end up with a negative number in front, it knows to cross over that fiscal year and grab those extra months. So this is what the end result of your report would look like, where you have one column and it's going to be 12 months through October. So if your fiscal year ends in December and you have 12 months, you know that you've grabbed in the prior 2 months as well. All right, tip number 6 deals with the start and end dates to create reports where we restrict by certain transactions. So this is a copy of a column definition where we want to essentially be able to take a monthly bucket and break it down into weeks. So you can take, using the start date and the end dates, to identify exactly which transactions you want to include in each column. So you'll notice that your fiscal year is the same all the way going across, and your period is the same, and your period covered. So you're essentially going to have 5 columns that are exactly the same. So it's pulling the same time frame, but down here under your start and end dates, you're now restricting it by transaction date. So you can use either days of the month like this, or you can use actual dates. So in this case, it's saying take day 1 through 7, 8 through 14, 15 through 21, and 22 through, this is only going to 28, but you can make this 31. So now it's looking at what transaction dates fall within that time frame, and it knows your fiscal period. So if you're like on a 445 and your period starts on April 3, it knows day 1 is April 3 and day 7 is April 10. So it's going to only pull transactions that fall in each of those categories in each of those time frames. Okay? If you double click in this cell, and this is just showing you each of those time frames, if you double click in the start date or the end date, it will allow you to actually put a date in there as well. So I actually had a client that ran daily revenue reports, and they would come in here, and they didn't necessarily need 4 columns, but in the one column, they would put today's date in the start and the end, and it would pull only those transactions that happened on that specific date. Okay? So you're able to use your start and end dates to filter the information that is already being defined up here. All right. The next one deals with being able to include account information or row code information within a report. So it's going to start with setting up a column definition where you define one of the column types as being account. So what that's essentially going to do is going to pull in the account that you have defined in the row definition in that column J, and that link to financial dimension. You can actually pull that and put that into the report here. Okay? Now sometimes you want to be able to see it as just an account, and sometimes you want to be able to see it as defined by the dimension as well. So you can actually go up to File, or go up to View in Description, Dimension Descriptions, and then it would actually display like this instead. So you can toggle that on and off depending on how you want to see that. If you wanted to have the dimension description on it, then you would have to have this checked. If you just want to see the account, then you would deselect that. But that's under the File and then the Dimension Descriptions. Alrighty. The next one is the same kind of thing, but this uses the row code instead. So rather than pulling in the financial dimension accounts that have been defined in the row definition, sometimes it's helpful if you can actually put the row code from the row definition into the report as well. So if you're trying to troubleshoot, you know, which line is it from the report or whatever, you can actually put the row code in there, and then it'll put the 100, 130, 160, 140, you know, 416, whatever the row code is, you can actually put that into your report as well. All right, the next one is radical rows, and this is going to talk about maybe being able to create like a tabular type balance sheet if you wanted to be able to put certain totals in certain columns, being able to use the XD format code to make a row undrillable. So let's say you ran a report and you made it so that you can drill onto the account level, but there's certain rows that you don't want people to be able to actually drill into. We can set that up. We're going to talk about using other dimensions in your row codes and your row definitions, and being able to use the row modifiers, and what does that give you? What does a row modifier do for you? And some of these things you guys will see, these are all attributes of a row code, or a row, I should say, of a row definition, but sometimes they get overlooked and people don't realize what they are. So the first tip that we're going to talk about is being able to present your reports where maybe you have subtotals in one column and you have grand totals in another column. And that's sometimes referred to as like maybe a tabular type balance sheet. So the first thing that you're going to need to do is set up a column. So this is an example of what the report actually looks like, where you have subtotals in one column, but then you have grand totals in another column. Okay. Now, this is a pretty simplistic example of this, but this is just one step in what you can do with this later on. So this is just a way of giving you an example of what this column restriction allows you to be able to do. You can take this beyond this and say, you know, I kind of showed you this when we were talking about the minority interest and being able to say only print these things in certain columns. So sometimes you only want certain rows to print in certain columns. Now you need to know exactly which column is going to be used in conjunction with your row when you're creating this, and you would use the column letters from that from your column definition to define your column restriction over here. So here's an example that we've set up two columns that are exactly alike. We've got column B and column C, and you can see that the fiscal year and the period are exactly the same in the period covered. So if you left this report to run as is and you didn't fill in this column restriction over here, you'd get two columns that were exactly the same. So what we're doing now is we're going back over here to the row setup, and we're going to change this column restriction, and we're going to say account balances are going to print in column C, or in column B, but in column C, we want our totals to print, okay? So it's going to go all the way down the page so that your report ends up looking like this, where you've got your subtotals in column B and your grand totals in column C. All right, so the next one we're talking about is the XD format code. So this is just an example of things that you can do with your print control, all right? If you double-click in column G, you're going to get all the options for your print controls. And this option is used to suppress the row in account detail report. So what this allows you to do is on a row-by-row basis, you can actually exclude rows from being able to be drilled into, even though the report was set up to run it at a financial and an account level. So maybe on a balance sheet, you've got the net income line set up to use all of the P&L accounts. Well, if somebody drilled into that, you know, they may end up looking at thousands of accounts. So you could set that up so that people can't necessarily drill into that on a balance sheet, but all the rest of the accounts you can. Or maybe you've got an income statement and you don't want people to be able to drill into the salaries line. You can still set it up that all of the rest of the report is something that people can drill into, but they can't drill into the salaries line. Okay, so the next one that I wanted to talk about was being able to use, what can you do with column J? And in column J we have, that is our link back to our dimensions. And normally when you're looking at this, you usually would set this up in being able to use the main account or whatever other segments you have defined. Most of the time when you're writing a report, you try and use just the main account. However, if you're creating a summary type report, you do have the ability to use account categories. And account categories are going to be where those are defined is on the account card in GP. So whatever account category you set up here, and this would actually work the same way in AX as well, is if you click on the in the account card, you give an account category that's going to flow over here. So then you can use the account category over here to pull in a group of accounts, and any account that has an account category would now be pulled into this. So in this example, this is from the cash flow. It's using the net income line, and it's pulling in essentially all of the P&L account categories to be able to pull in net income. Now, would that be the same as coming over here to your, coming back over to your account and putting in 4,000 through 9999? Yes. But this way, you know, if you add new account, I mean, if you were using a range, you'd get the same result. So this is just an example of being able to use multiple account categories as well. The next one I wanted to show you was being able to use the dimension value sets. So this is another example of kind of like account categories, and I don't know how many of you have actually seen this or ever heard of this, but a dimension value set is being able to create a named group of accounts within each dimension. So let's say you have division, account, and location as your division, or as your segments. You can create a dimension value set on each dimension. So in this example, we've created a dimension value set on account. And essentially what I did was, you know, pretend your fixed assets were all of the 1500s, but the asset itself were the even accounts, and the depreciation accounts were the odd accounts. So if you wanted to be able to get gross fixed assets, you wouldn't just be able to say, well, give me all my 1500s. You would need to cherry pick through the chart and say, okay, give me 1500, 1502, 1504, and so on down the line to grab just the assets to get gross fixed assets. What dimension value sets allow you to do is to name that group of accounts so that you can then use that in your report. Now, once you set up a dimension value set that's global, you can use it in other rows, you can use it in other columns, you can use it in trees. So when a dimension value set gets set up, you can use that in multiple places. Now, wherever you use that, if maintenance needs to happen, you only have to update it one time in the dimension value set, and it will update wherever it's being used within Management Reporter. Now, this is not anything that's set up in GP. You actually set this up in Management Reporter. And so this is something that can be used within Management Reporter independent of how you have things defined in GP. This is set up on an individual segment by segment, they call them dimensions in Management Reporter basis. So you can set it up on each independently. You can create a dimension value set that pulls in just these main accounts. You can also set up dimension value sets on divisions. So if you need to group your divisions together, and then you can use them in combination on the various different rows as well. So you could say, oh, I want to pull in this gross fixed asset dimension, and if you had a dimension value set up for a division that included 3 divisions, then it would pull these 4 accounts in combination with the 4 divisions here, rather than having to code every single account with every single division combination. And if anybody has any questions on that afterwards, we can go through that as a demo as well. All right, the next one is being able to use column I, the row modifier. So when you click on column I, it's going to pull up this screen, and then it gives you the option to use the account modifier or the book code. Okay, so the book code allows you to change essentially what ledger is going to be pulled on an individual row basis. So let's say you wanted to have a report where you had actual on one line and budget on another line, and then the variance as a third line, and you wanted that going down the page instead of going across the page. You can use the book modifier to actually pull budget information onto a row instead of just a column. The account modifier allows you to change the time frame that you're pulling for an individual row versus a total column. So maybe you need to have a beginning balance show up on a particular row, or maybe you need to pull in a year-to-date balance when typically you're just pulling in a current activity balance for the rest of the column. You can change your time frames on an individual row, and that's identified through the row modifier. All right, so the next set of tips are going to be talking about how can you make the report more dynamic and keep it clean so that things show up when you want them to and disappear when you don't want them to see, when you don't need to see them. So we're going to talk about being able to use the DES format code and how you can relate it to other lines. We're going to talk about using the account detail options to clean up the drill down. We're going to talk about using conditional print options to show just relevant data. And then we're going to also talk about using the report definition to suppress rows with no amounts. This one, a lot of people, by default, it's usually set up to do this, but people don't realize this until when they're setting up rows and row definitions, they don't realize how those two things come into play. So we'll talk about that. So the first tip we're going to talk about is using these description lines. Okay? So you'll notice here in row 110, we have a description line, and then in column D, we're relating it to row 80. So you'll notice column D says related rows, formulas, rows, and units. So the related rows part comes into play when you're talking about description lines and TOT lines. So you'll notice here in our TOT line, we're using the row codes to create a formula. On a description line, you can use the related row to tell it whether you want this row to actually display or not. So in this section, maybe you have a department that only has cost and they don't have sales. So sales would come in 0. Well, you wouldn't need necessarily this blank line if you didn't have sales. So you can relate description lines, excuse me, to other rows so that if this row, column 80, or excuse me, row 80 doesn't print, then row 110 wouldn't print. And you can see we've done this going down the page. We've done the same thing for row 170 and for row 260. And actually we've done it for row 290 as well. So 290 actually has a description on it as well. So here it's relating to row 2450, which I happen to know is the total line. So sometimes you may not have expenses for a certain section. Maybe it's a new report or a new cost center or something along those lines where you don't have all the expenses in for certain things, or certain departments don't have certain types of expenses or certain types of revenue or certain things like that where you don't want the descriptions to actually display. This allows you to relate that line to something else so that if it doesn't display because it's 0, then the description doesn't display either. You can do this with DES lines, and you can do those with underlines as well. And it's a nice way of being able to get your report to clean up so that when you generate it, you don't get extra spaces, you don't get extra underlines, you don't get descriptions that are not describing anything because the rows underneath it were all 0. Okay? All right, so this is on the report definition and being able to, when you drill into a report, having certain things default onto the report. And this, if you're on the settings tab and you click on the other button, this section right here can all be turned on or off so that when you drill down to the account or the transaction level, does it automatically include some of these things? Like maybe you don't want the account code or dimension, or you don't want the row codes, or you do or don't want certain things to display. You can turn some of these things on and off. This next one can be very, very handy, and this is actually the print control options in a column definition. Okay, so what this is doing is it's got 4 quarters set up, and depending on the month that you're running, you would need certain things to display and certain things not to display. So here's an example of we're saying we want column B is defining period 1, column C is defining period 1 and 2, and column D is defining periods 1 through 3. So in this case, depending on the month, certain columns you'd want them to display. So if you were running this for January, then you don't need columns C and D to display. But if you were running this for March, you would want column D to display. So I think this formula might be a little bit wrong, but what this is doing is saying in the print control, you've got period is less than or equal to the base. So P represents the period, which you have defined up here in the period attribute, and B represents the base date of the report. So if you run this for period 4, you know, these things would display versus they wouldn't display. So if the period is less than or equal to the base, the column will actually print. So you can use this to your advantage to get certain columns to print and not print depending on the report date. This again is talking about the settings tab in the report definition, and this is the option to suppress rows with no amounts. So when you have a report and you've got, let's say, 50 lines coded in the row definition, and the department that you're running something for only has 4 of these lines, do you want all the lines that were coded to display, or do you want them to disappear if they're 0? Well, you have an option on a report-by-report basis to choose whether that happens or not. All right? So in your Settings tab, display rows with no amounts. If that's not checked, then even though you have 50 lines and only 4 of them have values, only 4 of them will actually show. If you have this checked, then what it's going to do is everything that's coded in the row definition will always show in your report. And, you know, sometimes you need a report to do both ways. If you're trying to fill in a template that you're uploading to something else, you need your numbers to always show in the same spot. So you'd want your report to always show everything that could possibly be coded. If you're trying to make it a little bit more dynamic and you want some things to show and some things not to show, depending on the values, then maybe you don't have this display. So one of the things that people don't realize is when you're doing consolidated reporting with multiple companies, that you can set up a row definition that has all the accounts for all the companies, and even if they're on a one, you know, every line's got certain things on it, and you run this for multiple companies, if you don't have this checked, then only the accounts that are for that company will actually display. And this allows you to minimize the amount of maintenance that you need in your reports, because now you only have to have one row definition that you can use for multiple companies rather than having to maintain 3 different row definitions for multiple companies. Or even along the same lines of, well, I've got this department that needs to see a P&L like this, but they don't have these certain accounts, and I don't want to see all those extra lines. It still allows you to use the same row definition for multiple departments and just not have the accounts that don't have values, they just don't show. All right, the next section is going to be talking about the World Wide Web Viewer. We're going to talk about being able to open reports side by side, using the Go-To menu to jump to different key lines in your report, using the Show menu to show summary levels, and being able to download reports from a report group. All right, so this is just a quick reference as to if you're on CU15, this is what your web viewer would look like when you open up a report. So you'll notice down at the bottom, if you were using a tree, you can click on this section down here and you'd see the different organizational levels. You can actually rerun reports with a different report date using the report option. So if you click on that option, it will allow you to actually regenerate that report for a different time frame. So in this example, this one was run for March of 2017. If you click on this option, you could rerun this for February if you wanted to. You've got the option to use the Go-To to jump to different key lines. You can actually see charts and comments that might have been set up with this report. Now with XPS, or excuse me, CU15, you can actually print an XPS file. You can print right from the web page versus having to print one page at a time or have to open up the desktop viewer to print things. They've really enhanced the printing functionality in CU15. And then you also do have the option to export reports either to Excel or to have it open it through the desktop viewer. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is being able to open reports side by side in a viewer. If you're on Windows 7 or higher, you can use the Windows 7 Snap feature to actually line up your windows on your page. Because when you open up your reports, they're in a separate tab in their web browser, you can just grab that tab and throw it over to one side of the page or throw it over to the other side and it will snap in and you can actually view those reports side by side. Or, you know, if you would rather and you've got two monitors, you can just throw one report on one page and one report on another page because these are separate tabs. You can use the jump to or the go to jump to different key lines of your report. You can use the, show and then click on summary lines only and you'll take a report that's got all the detail information and it will actually condense it down and make a summarized version of that report. So it essentially will take all of your TOT lines and description lines and it will show just those as a report. And then you can print this if you wanted to. When you generate from a report group, it's actually going to open up in the group distribution page like this. And when you're on this page, if you click on the download button and then you click on the Excel portion, what it's going to allow you to do is it's going to export all of those reports into a single Excel workbook, and each tab would represent whichever report was included in that report group. So if you had 5 reports in your report group, then every tab, each tab, all 5 tabs would represent each of the reports. Now it will export based on the detail level that you generated the reports for in the first place. So if you said all the way down to an account level, you'd get, if there were, in this case, there's 2 reports in my report group, then I'd get a financial and account level for each report, and if it was using the tree, I would get every branch of the tree in this as well. Okay, so you can set up report groups to give you different combinations of financials versus account level reports, you know, whatever. You can also print from here as well. You can print to that XPS viewer, and every report that's in this report group would then get sent to an XPS viewer that you could then print them all at the same time. All right. We're going to make it mine, all right? So we're going to talk about default font styles, being able to hide the navigation pane if you need a little bit more real estate when you're trying to code reports or just look at reports. You can use the default report links location to generate reports where you want them to. So I'll show you when you're going to generate a report, all the various different places that you can use to generate reports to a specific location in a library. And we'll talk about, both of those, the links and then override where you want the data to actually go. So here's an example of a row definition. And if you go to font or the format and font styles on your menu bar, you can actually create different font styles that you could then use in your report. This is handy if you want to be able to maybe create some styles that might get used consistently for when you're creating rows and columns. You know, if you want certain rows to always look a certain way, you can set up some of those font styles so that anybody that's creating reports can click on the font style to actually apply that. Now this is, for those of you that were on FRX, this is how you had to do this if you wanted to be able to use different font styles within your report. You actually had to set some of these things up that you said Arial 12 bold or whatever. Now in Management Reporter you do have the ability just to use, you know, your options over here just like you do in Excel or Word. But this would be like the equivalent in like Word, where you can say header 1 or header 2, and it will put that font style, you know, on that line. So this is just a way of being able to create things to so that you've got a preset set of defaults, I guess, so that you can make some consistency. This one can be very handy. So this is typically what the report actually looks like. Or a row definition might look like. You'd see the navigation pane over here, and then you'd have your report open. Well, you can see that you're kind of limited here in being able to see, you know, you can only see to column E because you've only got so much real estate on your screen. If you use the Alt F1 key, or you can go to View Navigation, and what that allows you to do is to essentially hide this portion of the screen, so it gives you a little bit more room to work on stuff. You can do this in both the designer and maybe this is even more important, you can also do this in the desktop viewer, so that if you've got a report that's kind of already set up with landscape and maybe it's got 12 columns going across and you need to see it a little bit bigger rather than just zooming in on it, you can also hide the navigation bar, the pane over here, in the desktop viewer, so you get a little bit more real estate to look at your reports as well. So basically you just go up to View Navigation pane or hit the Alt F1 key, and that will alternate that on and off. All right, so this tip is being able to use different sections within Management Reporter to navigate and put things to different folders in your library. So the first place is on the report definition itself. When you're in the Output and Distribution tab, you can actually click here and you can choose a different folder to actually stick your report in. Okay. The next one is if you're in a group distribution. If you're running a report in a group report, you can click on the group distribution, and from the group distribution you can choose which file you want the group distribution to go to. If you click on the report distribution, you can send the group distribution, which is that link that I showed you on that last slide where it had just the two reports on it with the green tabs. The report distribution is where are the reports going in the library versus where's that group page going. So on this page you can say I want it to go to the same place as the report group, or if you deselect this, then you can, so let me back up a second. You can override the report location. So if you wanted to go back to whatever you had up here, you can have it set up to whatever the individual reports are. Or if you deselect that, you have the option of choosing, let me go back here for a second, choosing to override the report group. So if you click this, it's going to use this one. If you deselect this, now you can put the individual reports somewhere else. So you'll notice here the report group is going to go in draft, but maybe we want the reports themselves to go in our February folder. You can choose 3 different places as to when you're generating a report where you actually generate that report to. All right, so this is talking about the actual group itself. So this is an actual report group where we've got 3 different reports loaded here. So the top portion right here, we're looking at what company, what detail level, and what provisional level we're running for the individual, for all of these reports. So if you say that you want to override the individual reports, now it's going to run all of these reports for this company, for this detail level, and this provisional level. So even though this report might have been set to go to, on an individual basis, set to go to the account level, this one was sent to an account level, and this one was sent to an account level. When you generate it like this will only go down to a financial level. This could be handy when you're trying to create like a board package. You want to print all the reports and they don't need to see the account level. Even though the individual reports are set up to run down to an account level, you can override that and make all of these to run just as a financial level. So the second option is being able to run all your reports for a certain date range. So as long as this is checked, then these options are available and you can override what the individual reports were. If you deselect this option, then all of this gets grayed out and each of the reports in the report group will run as their whatever their individual reports were set up with. So this would be an example of maybe you want the income statement to go down to a transaction level, but you don't need the cash flow and the summary to go to a transaction level. You might want to override this so that each of these individual reports detail level will then be used. But then that eliminates the ability to choose your report date, and it's going to use whatever the default report date is on your individual reports. Okay? All right, the next one is using @unit and in your headers. This is talking about being able to do headers and footers in your various different reports. So we're going to talk about using @description, using text fields, that dreaded print, the day of the week that people might have still showing in their reports, and showing headers and footers in the web viewer. So in your report definition, this is looking at if you're using a tree, you may want the description from the tree to actually show up in the header of your report. So this is the unit description from our tree. If you add unit description over here, when you generate your report, it's going to show that here. Okay, so that's a good way of being able your reports to automatically tell you which one this actually is if you're doing this with a tree. The next one is, this is an example of your tree, and if you scroll all the way over to column N and you click on there, it's going to give you 10 additional text fields per branch of this tree that you can put information in. So here's an example. If you say, okay, well, I'm always going to use text field 1 as the department manager. You can put the department manager in text field 1 all the way down, and then you can use auto text to insert those additional text fields into your report. So in this case, I'm saying use the tree text field 1, and I put it in my footer so that when I generate this report, it's going to put that person's name on their page, and that will update for every single branch of the tree. All right, that dreaded Tuesday in our reports. I've gotten lots of questions on this one in the past, and this is dealing with the default date setup in your reports or on your individual workstations. So if you run a report to a desktop viewer, you can change this setting as your individual user on your workstation. If you're running the web viewer, this needs to be changed by the process service user. You will probably need help from your IT people to get this one fixed. But what you'd need to do is log in on the actual server that's generating your reports. Log in as the user that's running the process service, and they'll understand what this means. And then you'd go to your control panel, you choose region and language, and you would update that so it didn't include the DDD portion. It started with MMM. This is a per user, per workstation setting. If you're running desktop viewer, if you're using web viewer, this needs to be on the server as the process service user. Okay? All right, so when you generate a report and look at it at the web viewer, sometimes it doesn't put the header and footer information in. So if you go down to show and click on headers and footers, you can get the headers and footers to actually show as well. The need for speed. All right, so this is going to be talking about shortcuts, quick tips that you can use with your keyboard to get things to pop up and show in your reports a little bit quicker. So the first one is if you're in Management Reporter and you need to switch between your companies, you can actually just double click on the company down at the bottom and it's going to show that company screen. So normally you'd go up to File menu and you'd hit Companies and it'd pull up this screen, but you can also just double click on the company down at the bottom and it would do the same thing. And then you can just hit Set as Default to get your new company. The next one is anytime you see a drop-down option, whether it be in the dimension, in a row, in a column, anywhere you see this, this is actually a Microsoft tip, so anywhere, actually I think it's anywhere you see a drop-down, whether it's in Word, Excel, anyway, if you use the F3, it will open up the drop-down, so you don't necessarily, if you're on the keyboard, you don't have to keep going back and forth to your mouse. So F3 any drop-down will open with an F3 command. Find and replace can be your best friend when you're having to update budgets. So in a row or in a column, you can actually use the find and replace key to actually change all of your budgets. Like in a column, say you've got a budget ID that's called Budget 2016, and now you need your reports to run for Budget 2017, you can actually go up to Edit, Find, and then Replace, and if you can type in the values, and you can choose whether you want it to look for the entire worksheet or you can actually highlight a section that you want it to look for, and it will replace all of that information. I do that all the time at month end or year end when I need to update IDs for people. I also use the find option if I'm trying to troubleshoot something. So sometimes you're wondering, well, did I code an account in my report? You can use the find option to see if you coded 5510 in your report. So you could just put in find 5510, and anywhere you have that in your report, it'll stop and it'll show you where you have it. So if you're trying to figure out if you've got it in their duplicate places or whatever, that would be a quick way of being able to do that as well. The next one is renumber rows. So when you're in a row definition, you can go up to edit, renumber rows, and if you've gotten to the point where you've tried to insert a number of rows and now you've got blank row codes and it won't let you save it because they can't be blank, but you can't give it numbers because you put it in between row 110 and 120 and you inserted 11 rows, so it didn't have enough numbers to actually populate the row codes, you can go up to edit, renumber rows, and you can renumber all your rows. Now, anytime you have formulas that are associated to your row codes, as long as the row code was valid in the formula in the first place, it will actually update your formulas in that column D as well in your row definitions. All right, we're on a roll here. We got a couple more. Hodgepodge, changing the description on your building blocks. This was one I struggled with at first when we first went over. I'm like, how do I change my descriptions to get those to display correctly in my reports? How to print currency symbols. using AutoFit, and this last one, a lot of people don't realize that you can do this, and this can save a lot of time, is being able to open the most recently generated report. So the first one is if on the report definition, if you go up to File and then Properties, it'll open up this screen, and then you can change the description. If you do a file save as, and you leave the name the same and try and change the description, which is what I used to do when we were like in FRX, you can't do that because it'll say, oh, something exists with that name already. It's going to make you change the name up here. So in order to change the description, you'd go up to File and then Properties. Now you might be thinking, what does it matter what this description is, because I don't see it anyway. A lot of times you want to use report description as part of your report header, and this is where it pulls the description from. So if you're using this @report description auto text in your report header and you need to change this, you can go up to File, Properties, and do that. All right, so the next one is on a row-by-row basis. If you need currency symbols at certain places, again, that's under your print control. If you double-click on that, you can actually change and you can choose where you want. Now, you can put multiple things on these. So even though you might have a suppress row and an account detail, if you want a currency symbol, you can highlight both of those. You just use your control key to highlight them all. Actually, I don't even think you need to use your control key. I think you just click on them and it will highlight them. When you have multiple codes down here, I'll just put a comma between them. AutoFit is something new with Management Reporter. Now, Management Reporter is obviously not new, but it's not something that FRX had. So if you're coming off of FRX and you're going to Management Reporter, previously people would struggle with making sure that their columns were the right width. You know, you get the pound signs when you generate a report because it wasn't wide enough. You do have the option for AutoFit. When you choose something, it will now default with AutoFit. So if you don't want something to expand too far, you can put numbers in here as well still. If you need a column to be actually wider, you can't just change the width here. You have to change the width here. So just expanding these like you do in Excel does not make that wider when you generate the report. You have to define what you want it down here in the column width. All right, so this one is a big one. This is the one that people don't realize that this one's here. So this is on the report definition. When you open the report, right next to the Generate button, there is a button that if you hover over it, it's going to tell you the last time this report was generated and at what time it was generated, and if you click on it, it will open that version of the report. So let's say you generated a report and then you closed it and you're like, oh, I wanted to look at that again. You don't have to regenerate it to reopen it. You can just click on this button right here next to the Generate button and it will open that report again. If you've got multiple people running reports and putting them in different locations in the library and whatnot, whoever generated this last, that's what you're going to get. Whatever the report was generated last, no matter who generated it. Doesn't have to be the one you generated. It's the last one that was put into the library. Okay? All right, hey, the last four, we're on Glamour Shot. So we're going to talk about how you can make the report do cool things in terms of formatting. Okay, so we're going to talk about sorting, using indents, displaying negative numbers in red, and sorting by a natural when you drill down into things so that you can sort things a little easier. So the first one is using the format codes for sort. Okay, so here you can see we've used the format code sort, and then here you're telling it which rows do you want to actually sort. Okay, so Now this probably wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. You probably wouldn't do your sales in this manner. You probably wouldn't sort your sales from highest to lowest, especially if you only have one line for sales and one line for returns. This might make a little bit more sense if you were doing, maybe you had operating expenses in here and you wanted to sort these from high to low. The point is showing you how to use the code, what you're actually sorting, and then you're telling it which column over here to actually use as the sort value. So let's say you had 3 or 4 columns defined, one that was giving you month of, one that was giving you year to date, maybe you have some variances, maybe you're doing budget. Now you're going to tell it, I want it to sort on column D, these rows. And you can do the same thing down here with a sort descending. Okay, so it'll flip it around so that you're sorting in descending order instead of ascending order. They've added the ability to indent. So just like you can do in Excel or you can do in Word, they've added the indent. So now you don't have to spend your life at the indent bar, the space bar, pressing 5 times to get things to indent. You can highlight a whole group of things and just hit your indent key to actually get that to push over and make your reports look prettier. All right, so the next one is displaying negative numbers in red, and this again is on the report. This is on a report definition, so this is on a report by report basis. If you go to the settings tab, if you check this option, display negative numbers in red, this report will then show anything that's negative in red. And again, this is on a report by report basis. Okay, so the last tip of the day, hallelujah, is being able to sort when you drill down to an account level. If your main account is not your first account or not your first segment, but you want to sort it by the main account, not by the first segment, you can tell it to sort by natural or main account when you drill down, and it will reorder those accounts. Ta-da! We're at the last slide.
All right. So anything else to say before I jump in with some questions?
Nope.
I know one thing. It's 40 tips in 80 minutes. Woo, woo.
Oh.
But you know what? Everyone stayed on, so I know that they were learning something.
Clearly, I was not paying attention to the time. Sorry, guys.
That's okay. I love your passion. Here's one. How can you pull the account description as listed in GP? How can you pull in the account description as listed in GP?
Well, when you create a row definition, here, let me close this. Okay, so if you're creating a new row, if you pick the account, it's going to put the account description based on whatever you had there. You'll notice that was blank, so that filled that in. Now, if I have something there and I pull an account, it won't pull it. It won't change it. But if I delete that and then I go reopen that again, it will fill it in. Does that answer your question?
Okay. All right. And that's the only question we've got. And the answer is yes, that did. Good job. All right, guys. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry I kept everyone over. Hopefully it was worth it.
You need a nap now. That was fantastic. So good job. As always, it's fun listening to you. You love MR, and it's fun to hear the passion. So again, if you want to have a copy of today's deck, reach out to me at kim.peterson@interdynbmi.com, or always can use user experiences at interdynbmi.com, and I'll make sure you get a copy of that. And give us some time. We'll get a copy of this recording up on our YouTube channel so you can go back, re-listen, and share it with other people within your